everybody. How are we this evening?
Great.
Good, yay! Welcome to the Great Falls Public Library, and thank you so much for coming out this evening. I really appreciate it. Thank you for Betsy for traveling up here, and thank you for Cassiopeia Books for coming out and selling a copy of tonight's book after today's program. So just a few housekeeping things. As I said, my name is Sarah Culley. I'm the Community Engagement Coordinator here at the Great Falls Public Library. This is an awesome opportunity for us to have a one-on-one with Betsy. We are here to serve as a connection point to empower the community and enhance the quality of life by providing individuals access to information and social, cultural, and recreational resources. Just so you guys know, if you haven't been here before or it's been a while, the bathrooms are out the door to the right, and then emergency exits are again out the door to the right and then to the right again, and that's where the stairs are. Of course, in case of an emergency, don't take the elevators. Thank you for coming out, and just a quick note on who Betsy is. Betsy Gaines Quammen is a historian and a writer. She received a PhD from Montana State University, where she studied religion, history, and the philosophy of science. Her dissertation focused on Mormon history and the roots of armed public land conflicts occurring in the United States. She is fascinated at how religious views shape relationships to landscape. Her work has appeared in New York Times, New York Daily News, and the History News Network. Today, Betsy is here to talk to us about her new book, True West. And with that, I welcome her up.
Thank you. I will turn this on. Can you hear me? Should I put this up a little bit closer?
That's better.
Please.
That's good.
Hold on one second, ladies and gentlemen, while I get this. How's that?
That's better.
Okay. Hi! I'm just so glad to see all of you tonight. And thank you so much for having me. I'm thrilled to be here. I love Great Falls. I absolutely love this town. So it's wonderful. It's so neat. And I'm staying at the Hotel Arvon.
Good for you.
And so I walked over, and it was so pretty, and all the Christmas trees, and it was just great. And so thank you for having me, and thank you for being here. I think what I'll do, if this is okay with you, I'm going to kind of talk about the work that I've been doing and how I got to True West, because True West is about a lot. There are multiple topics that I talk about, these ideas that are so tangled together. And then I'd like to open it up to you to ask some questions, and then I'll end with a passage to kind of close things up. So I went to Montana State University for my PhD, and I also went to University of Montana, so I am Grizzly and Bobcat, and I like being both. But my PhD was on ways of seeing landscape, and I worked for years and years in Mongolia, and I began to see that different cultures, this is obvious, but it became fascinating to me that different cultures see landscapes different ways. And so I came back to Bozeman. I've lived there. I've lived in Montana for almost 31 years. And I would go from Mongolia to Bozeman, Bozeman to Mongolia. And when I came back and started working on my PhD, I wanted to look at how land was recognized or construed in the United States. And I realized that it was seen in many, many different ways. In Mongolia, it's a Buddhist culture, and as the politics changed from being communist to being capitalist, there were changes in the way that landscape was viewed, because all of a sudden it became it's a big mining area. There's a lot of copper mining that happens there. And so it was really interesting to see how culture changed and how landscape was considered. And when I came to the United States, back to the United States, I thought, one thing that might be really interesting, because this is really in my backyard, is how do Latter-day Saints perceive landscape? And that was a uniquely American way of seeing things. I mean, this is an American religion. The Book of Mormon came out in 1830. And I became really interested in the way that the Sagebrush Rebellion had these sort of Latter-day Saint perspectives, these early church theologies that very much informed the idea of land. And there is and it's not all LDS at all. It's not across the board Latter-day Saints, but there is an idea that land needs to be developed in order for it to be sacred. It needs to be built to please the eye of God. And I thought that was a really interesting sort of juxtaposition to some of the more Emersonian ways of seeing things, the preservationists who saw land and wildlife as perfect and pristine without the hand of human. But then I also started to look at the way that both of these ideologies kind of erased indigenous history and views, and one of them was unpeopled. That was the preservationists, that they considered land sacred as an unpeopled land, but of course it was peopled. And the Mormons looked at land as built and developed, and they really settled in these areas around water sources, preventing indigenous people from being able to utilize land that they too saw as sacred. So the Mormons brought the idea of Zion, which is sacred homeland. This was promised land that Joseph Smith had said they were going to have in Missouri, and they brought that idea to the Great Basin. And I looked at how that all worked, and in looking at this, I met with the Bundy family. Do you all know who the Bundys are? Okay, so I went and spent time with the Bundy family, and I looked at the way they considered land, and it was very proprietary. They looked at public land as not being in public hands. They actually don't acknowledge the federal government. And much of their sort of religious war is fueled by these early church theologies and in ways that they regard land as their own, as promised by Joseph Smith. And they also have this idea that they are somehow heroes in terms of saving us all while the Constitution hangs by a thread. This is a Mormon prophecy that's very, very important, that LDS leaders will step in while the Constitution hangs by a thread. And when I talked to Cliven, he said, and this is a direct quote, basically Jesus wrote the Constitution, right? And I thought, well, no, but okay. And so, so he has this idea that the Constitution is a sacred document and that he somehow understands it better than any of us or any constitutional scholar. So this was my first book, American Zion, which was a version of my dissertation, which hopefully isn't as boring as my dissertation was, because it was utterly boring. And it came out, and I was so excited. It came out in March of 2020. So I didn't have a book tour, and I was kind of bummed. And so I didn't, here it was my first book, and I wasn't really sure what I was going to do. And the world shut down, and we were all kind of sheltering in place. And all of a sudden, I saw on social media Ammon Bundy, Cliven Bundy's son, who, and just to give you a teeny bit of background, I know you all are familiar with this family, but this is a family that's in southern Nevada. They stopped paying grazing fees. Their cows grazed illegally for 20 years. When the government finally held them accountable, they came in to confiscate the cattle. The Bundys put out the message on social media, and it really galvanized the militia movement. 750 people went to southern Nevada, and it's called the Battle of Bunkerville. And even though there were no shots fired, this was a standoff that lasted a few hours. The interstate was closed down, and it really became a very foundational moment in militia history, in addition to Ruby Ridge, Waco, the Battle of Bunkerville. So this was really a big deal. And so the year after I visited the family, I went and I went and talked to them. I hung out at their home. They were very nice to me. They gave me a signed Book of Mormon. I promised I'd read it. I already had by that time, but a year later they were in Oregon, and they took over. There was an armed takeover of an Oregon wildlife refuge, and that was Cliven Bundy's son. So Cliven Bundy's in Nevada. His sons went to Oregon, took over this wildlife refuge. And I met Ammon after that, and I met Ryan and Cliven and the family down in Nevada, but I had not met Ammon. Ammon began to agitate during COVID. And I called him in April of 2020 and said, essentially, is this going to be your next Malheur? Is this going to be your next big movement? And lo and behold, he had begun an organization called the People's Rights Network. Are you familiar with it? It's militia-y, sort of, his version maybe of the Proud Boys, but it was something that you could sign up for and start to get text messages. So I did, and started to get People's Rights Network messages. And I thought, you know what? I am going to do a companion piece. I am going to write a companion piece to my first book. And I started to think about it. In my first book, I talk about the myths that really motivate the Bundys. And I began to think about myths on a much broader level during COVID and what it meant in the West. And bear with me, because my husband reminds me that I somehow get a little bit far afield before I make my points, but if you bear with me, I'm getting there. So anyway, I started to think about, okay, the Bundys, they are motivated by the white horse prophecy, which is the Mormon prophecy that Mormon heroes will save the Constitution. They're motivated by cowboy mythology. Ammon Bundy insisted on not wearing his prison uniform in court when he went to court in Oregon to be tried for his armed takeover of the Oregon refuge. He wanted to dress like a cowboy. He wanted that to be the sort of vision that the jury had. And he's also, this kind of unbridled freedom, libertarian, rugged individualism. And when I talked to him, he, at that point, was not, he didn't think COVID was a lie, because we were just absolutely being buried by misinformation, as you all recall, at the beginning of the pandemic and continued through. But he thought that the numbers were inflated. But one of the things that I was starting to see is how QAnon, are you familiar with QAnon? How that was beginning to take root within the whole pandemic narrative. At the time, he said, I don't believe in that stuff. And so we talked for about an hour and a half, and I got a hold of my publishing company and I said, all right, I really want to write a book about everything that we're going through right now and the mythology of the West and how that is going to play into our circumstances. I want to look at what that means. And what I realized, and this is going to come as no surprise to you all, that Western mythology is so foundational to what it means to be an American. This unending frontier, the ideas of manifest destiny, the ideas of endless resources. I mean, this is really a very, these are important and mythological ideas that loom large in the American psyche. And so this book traces the Battle of Bunkerville, that event in Nevada in 2014, to the January 6th insurrection. And I look at the characters that were involved in this, and one of the main characters that I focus on is Stuart Rhodes. Do you all know? Okay, he's in prison for 18 years for his role. Yes, he founded the Oath Keepers. He was involved in January 6th, and he lived in Eureka for a number of years. And I went up and met his recent ex-wife, Tasha Adams, who is amazing. And she was a co-founder of the Oath Keepers, has completely left the movement. And she really talked to me, and I love her. I mean, she is funny, and she's courageous, and she's fierce. And they met when she was very young. She was a dance instructor, and he was one of her students, and she said, he was a terrible dancer, and so they got married, and she had a vision of what he would become, this man who had, he'd been a lawyer, he'd gone to Yale, and he'd been in the military. He had so much promise, she felt, and she talks about his vision of the American dream, another myth that is American. And so we had a chance to talk, and we become friends, and hopefully we're going to do some events together, because she was so fascinating. He converted to Mormonism while he was involved with the Bundys, and also was really motivated by this myth of the LDS hero that would save the Constitution as it hung by a thread. And so I just thought, I'm going to talk to people about the ways that they see myths, the way that they see the West, and hear their stories. And so this book became about just about everything. It really is. I interviewed over 100 people. I was able to, the reason why it's named True West, it's a Sam Shepard play. But what is the True West? And there were so many different versions of it. So I look at kind of winding my way through mythologies and winding my way through stories at a moment in our history where we had big things going on, Black Lives Matter, big social justice, COVID and pandemic, and then real polarization in the country, in part really driven by Donald Trump, and social media. I mean, just we were siloed, we were out of relationship with each other, and we were getting poison, based on our algorithms. The QAnon phenomenon blew up during COVID. And so I went and talked to people. I actually, when I talk about January 6th, I watched Stuart Rhodes get up on stage at something that was called the Red Pill Expo, which is the red pill is the kind of conspiracy theory idea that if you eat the red pill, you can see things. It comes from the Matrix, right? When Keanu Reeves eats the red pill, all of a sudden he sees things for what they are. And so I went to the Red Pill Expo, and then I went to the Red Pill Festival in St. Regis, Montana. The expo was a big national thing in Jekyll Island, and I watched it on video. I went to the St. Regis thing that was at a park in that little town. But I saw Stuart Rhodes get up on stage with total anti-vaxxers and people who believed that the COVID was a lie, that it didn't exist. And constitutional sheriffs. Do you all know about? Yeah. So I thought, well, yeah, this is a network for you. I mean, all of a sudden I'm like yoga moms and Stuart Rhodes, and I mean it was, and then at lunch the movie was The Titanic Never Sank, and I thought, oh my gosh, things are crazy when the militia is pulling in all these folks. And so when we saw January 6th, we saw these coalitions of people that had come together because of the pandemic. And it really, I had been, in October, I'd seen Stuart Rhodes on stage doing this presentation, and I became unbelievably alarmed because it was in advance of the election and he was already talking about the fact that it was going to be stolen. He was already talking about the fact that militia were going to have to intervene. And as you recall, the debate when Donald Trump said, "Proud Boys stand back and stand by," that was big in militia movements. I mean, that was a real moment where they thought, we are Donald Trump's backup. So you had to Stop the Steal, again, all wrapped up. And I talk about the fact that these myths tangled together and created circumstances in the West, because I talk about the Intermountain West. I talk about Idaho, Montana, Colorado, Wyoming, Utah, Arizona, New Mexico, Nevada, and Washington and Oregon. and how we were seeing mythologies and misinformation and polarization taking a hold of communities. And I know that you all have recently had the campaign that you've launched against hate. And this was something that I was terrified about, because I was seeing people polarized so quickly and radicalized. And it really worried me. And there's so many stories in here. I talk about the Idaho Panhandle and these very conservative Republicans who are working against extremism. They are fighting extremism in their state. They're conservative as heck, but they do not want neo-Nazis coming into their communities, and that is happening. So I tell their stories. I tell a story of a woman in Glendive who is very much under the spell of QAnon, and how that causes tension in her family. And she moves from Maine to Montana because there's a religious exemption for vaccines. I talk about wolves and a wolf-friendly rancher who, one of the things that's happening is wolves have become political, and there's a certain vindictiveness in killing wolves and owning the libs. And so wildlife has become part of it. And I talk about, and these are all based on myths, the big bad wolf. And I talk about wilderness, gilded wilderness, and I talk about the Yellowstone Club and how the 1%, in addition to a number of people moving to my community, saw that stupid show Yellowstone and bought properties sight unseen because they wanted to be Kevin Costner. And that's that soapy, wide open vistas. I mean, I think people in urban areas were cooped up, and all of a sudden they saw the show Yellowstone. They're like, I'm going to be a cowboy. I'm moving to Montana. And Bozeman has grown 17% in 3 years. That's crazy. The people in the Idaho Panhandle that I mentioned, some of these conservative Republicans are fighting against, are lured by the idea of front lines and homelands and Christian nationalist communities, which Christian nationalism is not a myth, but they want to create these communities that are, like-minded people in their communities, so that they've kind of hung on to this idea of a blank slate. The West is a blank slate. Well, we all know it's not a blank slate. And I talk about the idea, I talk a lot about Native ways of seeing, and I had wonderful conversations with some of my, Chris Latreille, do you all, okay, I love Chris Latreille. And he was really wonderful in talking about, I mean, it was hilarious because we had these wide-ranging conversations. And Kathleen McLaughlin, who also is in the book, and she's a Butte writer, and she had really been focusing on the inequity that was caused by people moving to the state. Again, let's get a slice of the West, let's manifest our destiny, let's be cowboys. And so she was talking about these terrible inequities that were happening, because in Bozeman, our houseless community, it's just ballooned. And when I talked to Chris, he said, yeah, and I can't remember if it was in his newsletter or if it was a conversation he had with me, but he said, yeah, it's really a shame that people can't afford houses and they have to leave. Welcome to the last 500 years, mofo. And so, so this book is meant to be funny. It's meant to be challenging. It's also meant to say, okay, we all lived through this, and all this stuff was just tangled together and crazy, and our communities did become vulnerable. I mean, whether it's rich people coming in and displacing people, or people coming in, the extremists coming in. So I want to, and I'd like to open it up for questions, but I want to tell you one story that was one of maybe my favorite stories in researching this book. I went to Glendive and spent time there, and I met a rancher from Terry who he was really mad when I met him, and I sat down at a table, and we were having coffee, and I ended up having so much coffee, and I mean, this was like I talked to so many different people, which was great, because after COVID, I went, well, after COVID, I know we're still going through it, but after I got my vaccine, I was just ready to talk to people. And so I met Lance, and we were sitting at a table, and he was telling me how much he hated the government. He hated Democrats. He was so angry at the BLM, the Bureau of Land Management, not Black Lives Matter, and which I've got both BLMs in here. So he, you know, and he's going on, and he said, and I've been radicalized. And I was like, I at the time, it really took, it scared, I mean, that, you know, I thought, okay, I've never really had somebody just say that before. Like, I've sat down with the Bundys, but they never just said it like that. And it made me nervous because I thought, what does that mean? You know, this is a guy from Terry, Montana, a town of 600 people. And there are people in these communities that are feeling extremely disenfranchised, extremely angry. He told me he'd joined the NRA and he was buying guns. And I seriously at the time, and you know how when somebody says, I don't know about you guys, but I start to kind of wool gather when I get nervous, and so I'm not listening because I'm thinking, oh my God, what did he just say? What did it mean? And he's continuing to talk, and I'm, you know, wool gathering. And then he finally said, okay, I've said that to you 3 times. Are you going to write this down? And I thought, write what down? And he said, I want you to come to my ranch, write down my information. And I drove back to Bozeman from Terry, which is about, you know, 4.5 hours. But doesn't it seem, I mean, when you're from here, it's always like, oh, it's just 5 hours, you know. But it was just 5 hours back to Bozeman. But I'm thinking, am I ever going to reach out to this guy again? Am I gonna, should I do it? And I thought, no, I'm writing this book. He's invited me to his ranch. And I'm just going to read a teeny bit, and then I also want to read one tiny bit. I want to open it to questions and then kind of read the closing thing, but I'm going to just read this because I could not believe that this happened. So I sent him an email, and before I had left, the guy who'd introduced me had said, Betsy, you should give him one of your books, The American Zion, my first book. And I said, I'm not going to give him one of my books. You know, he's going to, and I said, Lance, you're going to hate my book. And because it's, you know, it's about the Bundys. It doesn't say that all ranchers are like the Bundys. I mean, it certainly doesn't say that, but I'm pretty clear about the way I feel about, you know, public lands and cows sometimes not being super kind to public lands. And, you know, anyway, I just thought, oh no, this guy's been radicalized and now he's going to read my book and I'm in trouble. So but I did get home and I wrote him an email and he wrote me back, Betsy, we must be on each other's mind. I was about ready to send an email to you. I couldn't decide if I wanted to finish the book first. I am a little over half done, which surprises me. Your book is very engaging, like being in a battle for survival. Not an expert, but your writing is charming, witty, and filled with sarcasm. Reminds me of a ranch woman on which I am an expert. This is anyway, this statement is a compliment to you. My ranch wife says that the apartment is open. They had an apartment for hunters. And so I look forward to seeing you on the 26th. I will chill some red wine and see if I can find some tofu. Don't forget your whiteboard. I'm a slow learner. I will lock up my guns if you promise not to shoot me in the back. I will brush up on my pocketbook, Rules for Radicals. I might even call Saul. Feel free to contact me anytime. Your friend, Lance. So, this has become such an important friendship. And so, in addition to everything I've just told you, this book is about relationship building and getting back into conversation with people at a time when people really want us to be polarized and there is poison being put out there on social media, and I will say right-wing television. I think that it's a false equivalency to say both sides, although I will say there are things on the far left that are troubling too, but I think that things on the far right now are much more troubling. That said, I'm for conversation. And so I end the book talking about this need. If we're going to be resilient communities, and we have to be, because right now national politics is bananas, and our communities need to be where we're in relationship, that we are, and we have healthy libraries, and we have healthy bookstores, and we have healthy universities, and we're in conversation with each other, that we're in relationship with each other. And so that's really where I end, that this is a hard time to have conversations with people we don't agree with, but it's absolutely imperative because there are people in power and there are people making money. They're gaining power and making money from us not liking each other and us being angry at each other. And so, and it's not easy, but I will tell you that Lance and I have become really good friends. And now, I just heard from him the other day, and he texted me and he said, do you know the podcast Reframing Rural? Do you all know that podcast? Oh, it's a really, it's this woman. She's young, adorable. She's due with her first baby in March. She grew up in Dagmar, Montana.
Oh, yeah.
She's great. And she's looking at regenerative agriculture. She's a pretty progressive young woman who, I mean, she's just exceptional. And this podcast, it would probably push some of Lance's buttons, but he recommended it to me. And I was like, thanks, Lance. It's so great to hear from you. How are you doing? And he said, I'm recovering from reading your book. So, and I thought, you know what? That is so cool. That's what I wanted. I want people to read it. I want it to sometimes make them laugh, sometimes make them feel uncomfortable. But to kind of, you know, challenge, but also sort of, I mean, it's in addition to everything else, it's really my dear, deep love letter to this place that I've been in. I grew up in Cincinnati. These are my dolls that I grew up playing with. This is Jane and Johnny West, and so I was obsessed with the West before I could even walk. And so, you know, I moved out here as soon as I could, and so I talk about all these places I love so much, all these people I love so much, and then challenge people, and then say, we gotta talk to each other. So it's about a lot, but yeah, it was a lot of fun writing, and I'd like to open it up for questions if you all have some.
What was the name of that podcast?
It's called Reframing Rural.
Reframing.
Reframing Rural.
Rural.
And her name is Megan Torgensen. And she is in Bozeman, and she's taking a maternity leave. So they're going to put it on hiatus for about 8 months. But there are a number of episodes out there that you can listen to. And I just had coffee with her, and she is amazing. I loved her. So recommend that wholeheartedly.
My question is, how did you get to introduce to the people that are in your book?
Okay, so a variety of different ways. Do you guys know Alex Bonanovsky?
No.
Okay, some of you do. She is a sheep, or she raises lamb outside of Billings, and so she was the first person I went to. She's really cool. She now works for, I think, the World Wildlife Fund, but she is so well connected with these small rural communities all through Montana. So that was the first person I went to. And one of the things that she does, she has a campaign and she does talks about people being in relationship with one another. And she said, I have one rule of thumb: don't be an asshole. And so that's kind of, and so from there I thought, well, I'll talk to her because she knows a thing or two about what I want to do. And so she introduced me to rural Montanans, and I was able to, I would go to a town and they would say, you need to meet 5 people. And so I ended up having people introduce me. And then when I went to, let's see, when I went to Spokane, I looked at Black Lives Matter in Spokane, and I had read about a man who, he's a naturalized citizen, he's Maasai, he's from Kenya, and he had been an artist that had done one of the murals for Black Lives Matter that had been vandalized. And so I talked to him because I'd seen him in the newspaper. When I was in New Mexico, I'm on the board of an organization there, so I just said, introduce me to everybody you can introduce me to. So in New Mexico, I look at different ways that Hispanic communities, indigenous communities, and white communities view their history. And during Black Lives Matter, the conquistador statues were kind of the sort of Confederate statues, and how these social justice movements took on a very different flavor. And I don't know if you all know that, but 2 people were shot in New Mexico over conquistador protests, the statues, and that they were 2 militia. One was a militia wannabe, the other one was an adamant Trump supporter. They were both influenced by MAGA, and they thought they were, Kyle Rittenhouse. And so each community in Escalante, I don't know if you've ever been to Escalante, Utah. I had a friend introduced me to a friend who'd grown up in a Mormon family, and then she had moved to Escalante. She told me her story, and then introduced me to everybody in town. The mayor, the hardware store owner, oh gosh, I met so many people. And then there had been a militia that had been formed in the last 2 years, so I met that militia. So it was just like, you should talk to my friend, you should talk to my friend. And it ended up, people have a lot of friends, and there were a lot of people who wanted to talk. So, good question. Yeah?
So, I noticed one thing you left out of your list of healthy things we need was healthy newspapers.
Okay, thank you.
And I was going to ask you, do you talk about that in your book? And
I
lost our newspaper here in Great Falls, at least in terms of
I know.
agora for op-eds. Is that a key critical
I
part
would say
of it?
absolutely yes, and I do talk about that in the end, the fact that small town newspapers are disappearing, and it's heartbreaking. And the Great Falls Tribune,
What's the best?
it was the best. It was the best. And it just, it's absolutely heartbreaking. And so, yeah, the people are getting national news, and they're focused on that, and they're not getting local news, and they're not knowing what's happening in their community, and it is causing more siloing. Yes, newspapers, and Kathleen McLaughlin talks a lot about that. We just did a presentation together, Chris Latreille, Kathleen McLaughlin, and I, in Missoula. And Kathleen was involved for years and years and years in Montana journalism, and worked, she's heartbroken about the Great Falls Tribune. So yeah, I absolutely 100%, yes.
It's not just small town newspapers. I lived in Baltimore for years.
Yeah.
And it used to take me all day Sunday to read the Sunday Baltimore.
Yeah.
And now the Sunday Baltimore is, it's like 2 sections, all national. They aren't doing anything local, even in the big cities.
Yeah. No, what's happening right now, I was talking to, it's happening with book publishing too, that there are only a few books we're seeing, for as much information as we can get online, we're seeing deserts of information in our newspapers, and it's heartbreaking. I absolutely, yeah.
So I noticed you briefly mentioned in your introduction about resources. Do you talk at all about water?
I do talk about water, and I talk about water in the sense that the myth of the rain follows the plow, and the idea, right, and the idea that people came here homesteading thinking that they were going to be able to have this be in kind of an Eden, the same agrarian myth, and right now, I don't talk about water and climate in terms of chapters, because it comes up over and over again in conversations. But I talk about the fact that one of the most important things, if we're in polarized communities and we have limited water and we're facing climate change, if we can't talk to each other, we're so in trouble. And I also talk about the fact that in the Colorado plateau, or the Colorado watershed, depending on the state, don't quote me on this, whoever's recording, take this with a grain of salt, but I want to say something like 80% of the Colorado water in Arizona, in terms of water that's being used for irrigation, is alfalfa.
Yes.
Yeah.
Saudi Arabia.
Yeah, and part of that's going to Saudi
Yes.
Arabia. Yeah.
It's really, just water's a big deal for me. I read Cadillac Desert.
Yeah, that's a
It's my
fantastic
early
book.
20s,
No,
and I moved on.
I do talk about the alfalfa, and again, I'm because this is about myths and conversations. These issues come up, but I don't I don't have chapters on those
Sure.
specific issues, so, yeah.
With all the lack of access to more local information and all of these new little groups forming and all, how much optimism do you have about our upcoming election?
Oh, God. I'm scared. And I just hope, yeah, I'm very nervous about national politics. I really talk about in this book this real need for local community resiliency. I have no idea. I mean, I you know, part of me thinks there's no way Donald Trump, you know.
we thought that a while ago.
Exactly. I mean, that's what scares me. That said, I think we still have time, and who knows what's going to happen with these many, you know, legal issues. But
he'd just be replaced by another crazy person, so.
I just, yeah, I wish
You
I
can
had a
run
great.
from jail. You're not disallowed from running for president just because you're in a jail cell either.
Oh,
Isn't there, I think,
you can't vote for yourself, but you can run.
You can run for president, you just can't vote for yourself if you're in jail.
so if you're in jail, and then you can let yourself out, right?
Uh-huh.
Well, once you're president, you can pardon yourself.
As long as there is, it's a better.
But there's nothing stopping
Not
an
on the
American
state
citizen
level.
from running for president from a jail cell.
But not on the state level.
Yeah.
So it's convicted on the state level.
That's right, so Georgia matters.
And New York.
And New
matters.
York.
And New York matters, yeah, thank you. Yeah,
So I'm really interested in your, like, Mormon, kind of history. So I formed a nonprofit with a progressive Mormon called Independence Rock Coalition. Independence Rock is on the Mormon trails in Wyoming, outside Casper. So we have a choose the left instead of choose the right kind of stuff from progressive Mormons. So I'm really interested in see how does Bundy deal with what, you know, President Nelson taking more progressive stances on some issues. I mean, and he's, you know, 90, and
I think he just passed away,
Yeah,
President Nelson just passed?
yeah.
When?
like last week.
Oh, wow.
Really?
Yeah.
Okay,
Well, that's
I didn't know
not
that.
news.
Anyway.
Sorry.
It was a conference and I saw it and I didn't know it. But okay, so it would be interesting to see who the next president of the LDS Church will be. But Nelson took a little bit more progressive stances than, you know, President Munson, you know, so then I'm just interested in how the development of the church and the leaders of church deals with, you know, and having more kind of progressive stances. I mean, like going against the kind of tweaking proclamation of the family and stuff like that. Nelson, I'm just interested.
No, and that's a really interesting question that I've thought a lot about, because the church came out and said the Bundys do not represent, you know, they're not, they don't represent LDS culture or the church.
It wasn't President Nelson, Jason Alive, it was
Oh.
another, what, the Quorum of the 12 leader.
Oh, gosh, okay, I'm
Not-
sorry about that, then I don't want anybody to
It's
be.
okay, yeah, it was the Quorum of the 12 president that passed. He was in.
I should
yeah,
know
he was
better.
90 as well.
I think I just read that really briefly and conflated the two. So thank you so much for correcting me on that. I should absolutely know that, and I don't want to send,
No, I can't remember who it is, but it was.
I don't want to send anybody
Yeah.
to their early grave.
Yeah. No, I mean, I just think that it's just Munson, I think, was the one that came out against Bundy.
Well, apparently, according to the Bundys, according to Ammon, they have real support at senior leadership, and then he calls the kind of mid-level people socialists and communists. So the progressive Mormons, he is not a fan.
Yeah, there's a lot in the Quorum and the 12 that are much more progressive.
Yeah, there's a lot of progressive LDS. I mean, I have a ton of friends who are LDS.
I have to choose the left, because the choose the right thing they wear instead of choose the right, and choose the left.
Yeah, and again, I'm sorry about saying that he was no longer with us.
Yeah, it's funny. I just think, I'm really interested in the Mormon landscape, and I do think it's build.
Yeah. Yeah, that was something that's really interesting because I did get involved with the a student group who were very, very committed conservationists and really, really focused on climate change. They really, there is a Mormon environmental statement that's quite good. It's really beautiful. So there's some, again, the Bundys don't necessarily stand, or they don't stand for what the church believes, and the church has taken some very good steps and made some very good statements about being stewards.
Ballard is one thing.
Ballard, thank you. Sorry about that.
It's okay.
Hopefully maybe we can edit that. I don't want to scare anybody. Yeah.
Okay, do you recommend reading American Zion? Is this a standard?
Absolutely, it should be required reading. Everybody should read it.
You didn't let me finish.
Sorry.
Prior to reading True West.
Oh.
Or is this a standalone novel?
No, on both, you can read, you don't have to read the first no, absolutely not. You don't have to read the first to understand the second. The first is really specifically about land use wars and the Bundys. No, you can read this without reading that, absolutely. So, yeah, I'll take one more question and then yeah, of course.
Sorry. Last fall, you mentioned Lance. I had dinner with Lance. I've known him for probably, I don't know, 10 years. I used to work for an organization called the Montana Wilderness Association.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah, no, he has the maps.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And what we had in common is he had an interest in the Terry Badlands.
The Terry Badlands, I went there with him.
Yeah, and our interests were different. I was interested in some wilderness study area and kind of providing some more permanent protection to it. And Lance is a real civic-minded guy, and I think that he saw it as a way to help the community in terms of tourism and putting it on the map. And so gotten to know him. I consider him a friend, and I hadn't talked to him for a while, but we got together again. And so I don't agree with Lance on
He's not been radicalized. That was the end of the story.
Well, that was it when you said that.
Yeah.
That didn't quite sound
No,
right to
he
me.
has not. He's very angry, and he's read the he read the chapter, and
he told me. He said, I just referred to you and thought this book, who interviewed him, and was telling me about it. And she said he thought it was, you were mostly fair about it. But it was, that's why now thinking back, I didn't realize he was going on about the Bundys. I don't know where's that coming from?
Well,
but even Lance, agrees that it's wrong not to pay grazing feeds, and he's a public lands rancher too. Generally, he's been quite open about, it's a good deal for ranchers, public lands, grazing on it.
Sure is.
And how that adds value to their whole land, ranch and land. So he is not a Bundy.
No, he's not at all.
He's coming from a different place, and I talked, and he was real helpful, and we helped him put together a brochure for the Terry.
yeah, he's really proud of that.
Yeah, and anyway, I just wanted to mention that, but there's different degrees here, and I haven't figured out either about some of the different people I met. And there might have been a guy by the name of Dale there who had a little store. Did you go down to that?
Yes, the Prairie Unique.
Yeah,
oh, I love
and
that.
Dale's a good guy too. And
He's a great guy.
Yeah.
That town, I love Terry. That's the thing. This book made me as I said, fall in love with these little towns and these people and conversation. So I'm so glad. Thank you so much for telling me that. But yeah, the end of the chapter says, not radicalized. He failed that test.
I used to do presentations about prairie landscapes and wildlands in the area, and did one to was a county commissioner and some other county officials, and most people were polite, but although one guy said, I'll spend $100,000 to make sure this never happens, and they're providing protection for the Terry Badlands. Then the commissioners are kind of difficult there too. But on the other hand, there are other people who were, sympathetic, and it's a mix.
Yeah.
And you're talking about newspapers locally. We on the liberal left side don't do a very good job of getting stuff in local. We talk about local papers. Where's the Terry Tribune?
Yeah, and the Terry newspaper.
And my experience is that they love to get information from, and those things get read, but there's not much, and there's pretty awful stuff in many of those papers, but I don't think we do a very good job of getting things in there. And same with whether it's a Lewistown paper or Courier up in Glasgow or
River Press.
River Press. Yeah. Anyway.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And I'm just gonna, and I can talk to people afterwards too and answer any questions, but I'm just gonna read one last thing to kind of put a book into this. And then I can sign books. So, what I talk about in terms of this kind of sums up what I talk about in terms of the way that I see the West. And this is after talking to a number of friends about land acknowledgements, and I have a wonderful conversation with my friend Francine Spang-Willis, who is Northern Cheyenne, and Chris, who's Little Shell Cree. I have a dear friend who's Navajo. I talked to another woman, Jill Momaday, who's M. Scott Momaday's daughter, and she's Kiowa. And so I spend the chapter really thinking about land acknowledgements, and some people are big fans, some people that think that they're just something, as Chris says, white people Google 5 minutes before a meeting. So and Francine said, what we really, and again, she doesn't speak for all Northern Cheyenne, but what she says is, I just want people to think about what land acknowledgement means. Like, what does this mean? So I kind of write about what it means to me. The West is more than a playground or a storage site awaiting resource extraction. It's more than a second home or a selfie. It is a land of many cultures. It's a place of countless generations. A place where dancers in jingle dresses move to drums, thrilling powwow attendees. A place where rock walls hold messages drawn long ago. It's a land where wolves still den and nurture pups, despite vicious eradication programs. Where people run under high canyon walls and children swim in frigid snowmelt. Men have died in mines here under cruel conditions. Militias have gathered while book clubs have read. This is a place where horses gallop, bears binge in the time of hyperphagia, and ponderosa pines topple in drought-desiccated soils. Glowing neon signs beckon from rain-soaked windows, and pronghorn tangle and die in barbed wire. Here there are introduced condors that nest in cracks of desert rock walls, and human families who struggle to secure homes. It's snow chains on passes, businesses closed for the season, and lariat loops that wildly fly towards the rear legs of racing cabs. It's mile markers, mountain lions, and slag heaps. A rifle shot felling a 12-point elk, and AM radio blaring preachers and conservative rabble-rousers. This is a place of innumerable footprints of humans and beasts stamped in dust, mud, and snow, where people live out on the landscape and need what the landscape offers. We must concede the history. We must recognize forebearers. We must honor the place as interconnected and whole, not chopped into parcels by arbitrary boundaries or gutted for commodities. Actions without consequence, human dominion, inexhaustible abundance, and dualism, the idea that we are separate from nature, are myths bearing down on us. These must first be acknowledged before we begin to consider a better place, a better story for this place. So, thank you. Thanks all. Much appreciated. And this, I just can't thank you enough for having me. This was super fun.
Yes, thank you. Well, thank you everybody so much for coming out tonight. I hope that you enjoyed that. As Betsy said, we are going to be selling books with Cassiopeia Books over here, and then she will be signing them right there on that lovely other table. So feel free to stick around for a while. Technically, the library does not close until 8 o'clock, so we do have some time to hang out. Just so you guys are aware, we do not have any more adult programming until January, but if you have kiddos in your family, we are hosting a holiday party this weekend.
Saturday.
Thank you, Jake. Saturday. So please bring your small chillins right down here. Santa will be here and all of that jazz. And otherwise, stay tuned because we are announcing a lot of fun new things starting January 2nd here at the library. So stay tuned for that because I don't want to spoil anything yet. So thank you again for coming out. Please buy a book and hang out with us for a little longer.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Sarah, did you want this signed?
Okay, so this is